Millionaire found father collapsed in Maid's arms. What she revealed turned his world upside down. Power, wealth, prestige. To the world, the Langston family had it all. Generations of billionaires, untouchable influence, and a name spoken with reverence in the highest circles of business and politics. Their mansion, a sprawling estate of marble and glass, was more than just a home. It was a symbol of legacy. But legacies often carry shadows. Secrets buried so deep that even money can't silence them forever. One night, as the heir to this dynasty walked through the halls of his family estate, expecting only the silence of midnight, he heard something he never thought possible. The sound of his father, an unshakable titan of industry, sobbing. Not the quiet grief of a man shedding tears in solitude, but a raw, broken weeping that echoed through the darkened corridors. Drawn by disbelief, the son followed the sound. Each step felt heavier, each breath more unsteady. And then, he froze. At the far end of the dimly lit hallway, in the glow of a single lamp, stood a sight that shattered everything he thought he knew about his family. His father, the man who never bent, never faltered, was collapsed in the arms of the family maid, a black woman who had quietly served their home for decades, always invisible, always silent, always overlooked. But she wasn't just comforting him. She was whispering words that shook his very soul. Words that weren't meant to be heard. Words that carried the weight of history, injustice, and a truth buried beneath the polished floors of their gilded world. That night, the walls of privilege and power began to crack. And as the son stood in stunned silence, one question burned in his mind. What secret could possibly bring his father, the most powerful man he knew, to tears in the arms of someone society had always dismissed? The answer would change everything. The Langston family name was carved into the foundations of America's wealth. Skyscrapers bore their initials, universities carried their endowments, and charities displayed their logos on gleaming plaques. To the outside world, the Langstons embodied success, discipline, and unshakable strength. At the head of this dynasty was Richard Langston, a billionaire known for his ruthless brilliance in business. He was a man who spoke with authority, commanded entire boardrooms, and never allowed the world to see weakness. His presence was steel, calm, cold, and calculated. People called him the Fortress because no one had ever seen him break. Beside him, or rather in his shadow, was his only son, Alexander Langston. Groomed from birth to inherit the empire, Alexander had grown up with every privilege imaginable: private schools, lavish vacations, a penthouse in the city, and a life insulated from hardship. Yet behind the wealth, Alexander always felt a strange hollowness. His father demanded perfection, but offered little affection. Success was praised. Vulnerability was punished. And in the background of this gilded life was someone who rarely received notice: Evelyn. She was the maid who had served the family since before Alexander could walk. A black woman in her late 50s, Evelyn moved silently through the corridors of the Langston estate, polishing silver, preparing rooms, and caring for details no one else cared to notice. To Alexander, she was simply part of the furniture of his childhood. Always there, always reliable, but never truly seen. Yet Evelyn had a quiet strength. Her eyes carried a depth, as if she had lived through storms that no one in that marble estate could ever imagine. Sometimes, when Alexander was younger, he caught her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite define. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't duty. It was something more complicated, something almost maternal. But whenever he asked his father about her, Richard dismissed it with a curt wave. She's just the help. Years passed. Alexander grew into a polished young man, the very image of privilege, but inside, he felt the gnawing absence of warmth. His father was proud of his accomplishments, but never proud of him. Their conversations were about stocks, mergers, and legacy, not about dreams, fears, or family. And so Alexander built a kind of distance. He admired his father but feared him. He respected Evelyn but overlooked her. He lived inside the role written for him, never questioning, never rebelling. Until that night, the night when the mask of power cracked. The night when Alexander heard the one thing he thought impossible, his father's grief spilling into the quiet of their grand estate. What Alexander didn't yet know was that Evelyn held a truth far older than his empire, a story hidden beneath generations of silence, a truth his father had buried under marble floors and golden chandeliers, a truth that was about to rise to the surface. It began with a sound Alexander had never heard before. The Langston estate was always silent at night, its marble halls echoing with nothing but the soft hum of air conditioning. But as Alexander returned late from a board meeting, he froze at the base of the grand staircase. From his father's private study came muffled voices, low, trembling, almost broken. And then, a sob. Richard Langston, the fortress, was crying. Alexander's first instinct was disbelief. His father had taught him that tears were weakness, that vulnerability was failure. But there it was, raw, unfiltered grief breaking through the walls of the most powerful man he knew. Slowly, Alexander stepped closer, keeping to the shadows. The heavy oak door was cracked open, just enough for him to see, and what he saw shook him to his core. Richard Langston, his back hunched, his face buried, not in his hands, not against a polished desk, but in the arms of Evelyn, the family maid. Evelyn's hands stroked his shoulders gently, her face etched with sorrow, but also with the kind of tenderness Alexander had never seen exchanged between his father and anyone. The sight was jarring, his father vulnerable, Evelyn comforting him with an intimacy that didn't belong to the hired help. Questions erupted in Alexander's mind. Why Evelyn? Why not a friend, a confidant, a business partner? What tied his father to her so deeply that he would allow her to see his tears? The next morning the tension lingered. Richard avoided Alexander's gaze at breakfast, his face stoic once more, as though the night before had never happened. Evelyn moved silently through the dining room, her usual calmness hiding something Alexander now couldn't unsee. But curiosity gnawed at him. Over the following days, Alexander began to watch more closely. He noticed how Evelyn seemed to know his father's moods before anyone else. How Richard's cold exterior softened in her presence, if only for a second. How certain silences between them seemed to carry entire conversations. One evening, while passing by the kitchen, Alexander overheard a fragment of conversation, his father's voice low, sharp with desperation. "It can't come out. Not now. Not ever." Evelyn's reply was firm but pained. "He has a right to know, Richard. Keeping it buried is killing you." Alexander's heart raced. Who was he? What truth was being buried? And why did Evelyn, of all people, sound like she had the authority to challenge his father? He decided to dig deeper. First, he went through the family archives, old photo albums, documents locked away in cabinets no one touched. At first, everything looked normal. Pictures of galas, charity events, handshakes with presidents and world leaders. But then, tucked away in the back of an album, he found something strange. A photograph. It was faded, edges curled with age. His father, decades younger, stood beside a woman, smiling, carefree. And that woman wasn't his late mother. Her skin was dark, her smile radiant. And though she looked different, there was something in her eyes Alexander recognized. Something that reminded him of Evelyn. His chest tightened. Could it be? As if the universe conspired, Evelyn caught him staring at the photo later that night. Her face went pale, her voice steady, but soft. "You weren't supposed to find that yet." The word yet echoed in his mind. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. His father's secrecy, Evelyn's closeness, the photograph. It all pointed to a truth far bigger than he could piece together. A truth that had the power to shake the very foundation of the Langston legacy. And Evelyn, always silent, always invisible, seemed to be holding the key. For the first time in his life, Alexander realized the empire he thought he understood was built on stories half told. And now, one of those stories was clawing its way to the surface, a story his father had spent decades trying to bury. The storm broke on a night no one expected. It was during a formal dinner at the Langston estate, a gathering of board members, investors, and close family. The chandelier sparkled above the long dining table, laughter and crystal glasses filling the air. For outsiders, the Langstons were untouchable, wealth, power, legacy polished to perfection. But beneath that golden facade, Alexander could feel the cracks widening. His father sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, but his eyes kept darting toward Evelyn, who moved quietly among the staff. Each glance was too sharp, too loaded. Alexander, now aware of the whispers he'd uncovered, saw every detail with fresh eyes. And then it happened. One of the guests, a senator's wife, made a careless remark about keeping the staff in their place. Laughter rippled around the table, light-hearted to them, but cruel, cutting. Evelyn froze in her tracks, her hands trembling just slightly as she refilled a glass. Alexander noticed, but more importantly, so did Richard. His father's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. And before Alexander could process it, Richard stood abruptly, his voice like thunder against the clinking silverware. Enough! The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him, stunned by the outburst. Richard's face was pale, his composure unraveling. He looked at Evelyn, then at Alexander, and for the first time in his life, the fortress of a man seemed on the verge of collapse. Alexander felt his chest tighten. This was it. Whatever truth had been buried for decades was about to surface, here, in front of everyone. Richard opened his mouth, but his voice cracked. He faltered. And then Evelyn did something no one expected. She stepped forward. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of generations. If you won't say it, Richard, and I will. The air thickened. The staff stopped moving. Even the guests leaned forward, sensing the moment was bigger than them, bigger than dinner or politics. Evelyn's eyes met Alexander's. In them he saw pain, strength, and something terrifyingly familiar. Alexander, she began, her words slow, deliberate. Your father has spent his entire life building walls to protect this empire. But those walls weren't built of stone. They were built on a lie. Alexander's pulse hammered in his ears. She continued, her voice never breaking. Decades ago, before this wealth, before the image, your father fell in love. With me. Gasps erupted. Forks clattered against plates. Richard's head dropped into his hands as if the weight of his secrets had finally crushed him. Evelyn's gaze sharpened, piercing through the silence. We were young, reckless, and in love. But society, this family, and this world did not allow a black woman to stand beside a man destined to be a billionaire. They told him it would ruin everything, his inheritance, his reputation, his empire. So they tore us apart. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. But not before I bore a child, a son. The words hit Alexander like a bolt of lightning. His hands shook, gripping the table as his mind raced. A son, Evelyn repeated, her voice breaking. A child of both worlds. Yours, Alexander. You are not only your father's heir, you are mine too. I am your mother. The room exploded with chaos. Gasps, whispers, stunned silence. Board members exchanged horrified looks. Guests turned away in disbelief. But Alexander heard nothing. His world had stopped. The pieces of the puzzle, the photograph, the intimacy, the secrecy, all snapped into place in one devastating moment. He wasn't just the son of Richard Langston. He was the hidden son of Evelyn, the maid. And with that truth, everything, the Langston name, the fortune, the power, shifted forever. The billionaire empire had been built not only on wealth, but on silence, shame, and sacrifice. And now that silence was broken. The dining hall was still trembling with the echo of Evelyn's words. What had once been a place of prestige and untouchable power was now a courtroom of silence. The chandeliers glittered above, mocking the darkness that had just been unveiled. No one moved. No one breathed. Alexander sat frozen, staring at the woman he had known all his life as the maid. Her steady presence, her quiet strength, her eyes that seemed to know more than they ever revealed. All of it finally made sense. She wasn't just a caretaker of the house. She was the keeper of his very bloodline. Richard, his father, looked utterly broken. His broad shoulders, once the very image of dominance and authority, sagged beneath the crushing weight of years of silence. He had hidden the truth not only from the world but from his own son. And now, the walls had come down in the most public, humiliating way possible. The guests whispered behind napkins, some exchanging nervous glances, others sipping their wine as though they could drink away the discomfort of the moment. But for Alexander, their presence didn't matter anymore. His entire world had been rewritten in a single confession. He rose slowly, his chair scraping the marble floor loud in the silence. His voice shook, but his words carried the fury of betrayal and the ache of longing. "All these years," he said, looking at his father, "all these years you let me believe she was just staff, that she was beneath us, when all along she was my mother?" Richard's lips quivered, his voice breaking as he tried to speak. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting her. Protecting everything." But Evelyn's eyes flashed with pain. "No. You were protecting yourself. Protecting an empire built on fear of what others would say. Protecting an image that never mattered as much as the truth." Her words cut deeper than any blade. For the first time, Alexander saw both of them. His father, broken by regret, and his mother, scarred by a lifetime of silence. He felt anger, yes, but beneath it, a dawning understanding of what they had both endured. His father had chosen power over love. His mother had chosen silence over destruction. And he, Alexander, was the result of both choices. The guests, sensing that they were witnessing something far bigger than a scandal, quietly began excusing themselves. Chairs shifted, doors opened and closed, and soon only the three of them remained, father, mother, and son, bound by blood and torn apart by secrets. Evelyn's hands trembled as she stepped closer. "I never wanted you to find out this way, but I could not stand by any longer, watching history repeat itself, watching lies poison the very family I once dreamed of." Alexander swallowed hard, his chest heaving. A lifetime of questions now had answers, but the answers were heavier than he ever imagined. At last he turned to his father. "What happens now? You've hidden her. You've hidden me. How do you expect me to carry this empire knowing it was built on erasing the very woman who gave me life?" Richard's face crumpled. Tears streamed freely, the iron mask of a billionaire falling apart. "Then don't carry it as I did," he whispered. "Carry it as yourself. Carry it with truth." The silence that followed was suffocating, but within it was something new. Possibility. In the weeks that followed, the world did not stay silent. News of the scandal tore through headlines. Billionaire's secret revealed. Heir discovers Black Maid was his mother. Commentators speculated about the downfall of the Langston Empire, while activists hailed Evelyn's courage for speaking the truth. The family's reputation, once untouchable, was now fragile. Investors panicked, board members resigned, and lawsuits loomed. But amidst the chaos, Alexander did something his father never dared to do. He told the truth. At a press conference that shook the financial world, Alexander stood before cameras, Evelyn at his side, and admitted everything. He spoke not as a billionaire's heir, but as a son who had been denied the truth of his own identity. "My name is Alexander Langston," he began, his voice steady. "For years I was taught to believe in an image of power, wealth, and prestige. But that image was built on silence, on the erasure of a woman who gave me life. Today I honor her. Evelyn is not our maid. She is my mother, and she deserves recognition, dignity, and respect. More than that, she deserves justice." The room erupted with flashes of cameras. Reporters shouted questions. Some called it a scandal, others a revolution. But to Alexander, it was liberation. For the first time, he felt whole. Richard watched from the sidelines, his face lined with shame but also with something softer, relief. He had lost control of the empire, but in losing it, perhaps he had finally given his son something far greater: freedom. The impact was undeniable. For Evelyn, it was vindication. Years of quiet suffering were finally acknowledged. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a shadow in her own son's home. She was seen. For Alexander, it was a rebirth. He was no longer just the billionaire heir, carrying the weight of someone else's legacy. He was the bridge between two worlds: wealth and struggle, power and silence, white and black. and he vowed to use his voice to ensure that no one else would ever be erased the way his mother had been. For Richard, it was penance. The empire he once built stood on shaky ground, but perhaps in its cracks, there was room for truth to grow. He would never undo the pain of the past, but he could spend his final years facing it instead of burying it. The story ended not with wealth or power, but with something far stronger: truth. And the question that lingered long after the press conference ended, long after the headlines faded, was one that Alexander himself posed at the close of his speech. How many more families have been silenced by fear, by prejudice, by the need to appear untouchable? And how many more lies will it take before we finally choose truth over image, love over legacy? The world had no answer. But one thing was certain: this time the silence had been broken,